Well, I thank the chairman and I thank the panel for your testimony this morning. First, I'd like to observe how reasonable the Republicans sound today on the issue of climate change. There must have been a conversion on the road to Damascus recently. Dr. Eckenwurzel, do you agree that most or all climate models consistently underpredict the climate change rate?
Yes, because there's a double-edged sword of uncertainty with climate change. The best case scenario is we could do that well, but the worst case scenario tends to keep surprising us. It's a bigger error bar on that.
Well, given the lag between CO2 emissions and its impact on the climate, do you believe there's a realistic way we can avoid temperature increase of less than 2 degrees C by carbon reduction emissions alone?
We have to have a mix of emissions reductions, all sources of carbon storage as well that we can think that is safe as for communities, so we can get to a net zero situation by mid-century.
So then what our alternatives are to reduce emissions to avoid climate catastrophe? What are our emissions?
As been said, we have to manage our forests so that they don't go up in flames and lose the carbon they're sequestering. We have to increase the land sink in our agricultural practices. We also have to perhaps carbon capture and sequestration. There may be a bridge for innovation through utilization. However, it has to transition. We have to figure out how to sequester the carbon and keep it out away from the atmosphere.
Well, then considering climate intervention or geoengineering, such as injecting sun-reflecting particles into the stratosphere, how much understanding do we have of climate intervention as to its effectiveness or its possible side effects?
We have a lot to do with the social sciences of the governance of such an issue of just injecting stuff into the stratosphere that would affect perhaps monsoon rains and all sorts of consequences around the world and give us perhaps hazy skies, beautiful sunsets, but hazy skies, and other consequences. We need more research in this space before.
Well, what do we need to do to develop sufficient expertise with climate intervention to even decide if it's a possible way to manage climate change while we reduce our carbon emissions?
First of all, make sure we invest in NASA and NOAA and our infrastructure to make sure that every time a volcano emits anything, that we are able to track it and figure out what the consequences are, because that is the natural analog to what these experiments would say. And there are many other ways we can study this problem before we would do some other experiments.
Well, then do agencies such as NOAA and NASA and the DOE have the capabilities to generate a baseline understanding of the stratosphere?
Absolutely. And there are sensors and satellites we would love to have deployed and to double down on science investment on these persnickety problems, as you say.
Well, I might be proposing legislation to do that. And before I finish, I just want to say, Mr. Shimkus, thank you for attributing the quote to me that it's just an engineering problem. But I have to say that was taken out of context. I was referring to nuclear waste being an engineering problem, but I also said that nuclear waste will need a political solution. Now, that whole context also applies to climate change. There are engineering solutions that need to be addressed, but we need to have the political will to put those solutions into effect. And so instead of just sounding reasonable, please work with us to find solutions that are sufficient to the threat.